Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subscribers and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. And if you would like to take a couple extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you guys so much for all your support. Okay guys, so what if I was to tell you that there's a shipwreck out there that not that many people know about? I wasn't even aware of this shipwreck until about a few months ago. And if you ask any maritime historian about this shipwreck is largely known as the White Star Line's first Titanic. And I'm like, wait a minute, it's known as the first Titanic? How could that be? So that caused me to go and do some research into this shipwreck. And honestly, when you study the story of it, this shipwreck really does have quite a few similarities to the Titanic disaster. So I thought I would do my part in this video and share the story of this largely forgotten vessel, so maybe its story can be more well known again. Okay guys, well hey, without any further ado, join me in this video as we now tell the story of the RMS Tayleur.
The RMS Tayleur was a full-rigged iron clipper ship that was chartered by the White Star Line in 1853. She was large, technically advanced, overall a very well-built vessel for the period. Now, even though this vessel was chartered by the White Star Line, it's important to note that this White Star Line is not the same company that built the RMS Titanic. You see, the White Star Line used to be owned by another company in the early to mid-1800s. The original White Star Line was founded in 1845, but it filed for bankruptcy in 1867. And then in 1868, the company was purchased and owned by Thomas Ismay. Now, once Thomas Ismay bought the company, this is the company that would eventually come to own and build the Titanic. So 1868 is basically the beginning of the White Star Line company that we're all familiar with. Although the company did have a lot more history to it in the days before Ismay bought it in 1868. So with all that in mind, remember that the RMS Tayleur, even though it did belong to the White Star Line, it is not the same White Star Line that we are all familiar with. The tragedy of this vessel occurred in 1854, thus making it belong to the original White Star Line, not the new White Star Line that would come to own the Titanic.
Now, the primary purpose of building the Tayleur was in order to take passengers between the UK and Australia. At the time, there was a huge gold rush going on in Australia during the 1850s, and the shipping lanes between those two countries and the amount of people going between the two countries was really busy. So the White Star Line needed another ship in order to help, take people from one country to the other. But because there was such a demand for ships to go between the UK and Australia, construction went very fast on the Tayleur. From the time construction began to the time the ship was finished, it only took 6 months. So think about that. The entire time from beginning construction to the vessel being launched and final preparations on the vessel being made was just 6 months.
But because construction on the Tayleur was so fast and so rushed, there were a number of design problems with the ship that were not noticed. And what makes this even worse is that the Tayleur never had any sea trials. Now, from what I could find, apparently sea trials were not that common of a thing to occur at the time. But even still, the fact that this vessel was never tested on open water before she set sail on her maiden voyage only made what happened to her all but inevitable.
So while I was researching this vessel, I found a list that showcased all the design problems with this vessel. And when I read these to you, honestly, it blows my mind that this vessel was even cleared to set sail in the first place. I mean, even though the Tayleur didn't have sea trials, you would think that they would notice a few of these things while the ship was under construction. And the fact that they didn't just goes to show how rushed they were to get this ship completed and get it out into the open water and get this vessel to start generating revenue as quick as possible. This vessel is clearly a sign that in this instance, the White Star Line was more interested in making money than they were in the safety of all of those on the ship. So some of the design flaws with the Tayleur are of the following. The masts of the ship were found to be unbalanced. That's pretty bad. The rudder was too small for the vessel. The rudder was too small. The ropes frequently jammed as they were too new and stiff. So all the ropes that they used to, raise and lower the sails and do other things on the ship, they were too new and stiff. They weren't worked in at all. And the ship was never tested on open waters before sailing. We talked about that. But the most significant defect with this vessel, which how do you not notice this when the ship is being built? But due to the iron hull, it is believed that the hull severely interfered with the compass readings on the ship. So that means that the compass that they used to navigate the ship in the open water, it was giving faulty readings because it was getting thrown off by the iron hull of the ship. How do you not notice these things before a ship sets sail? I mean, you would think you would notice a compass starting to act weird when it gets around the iron hull while you're putting the compass into place. I mean, honestly, this kind of thing just blows my mind.
But even with all of these problems, the Tayleur departed Liverpool on January 19, 1854 for her maiden voyage. She was bound for Melbourne, Australia, with a total complement of 652 passengers and 71 crew members. But, to make matters worse, if they couldn't be any worse already, it turns out that of the 71 crew members who were on board the Tayleur, only 37 of them were trained as sailors.
For the first 2 days of the voyage, everything seemed normal on board the Tayleur. I'm sure the captain and the crew would have noticed at this point that there were a few things about the ship that weren't quite right, but at this point the vessel's already underway and things are continuing on, so they just continued on the voyage. But the one thing that they wouldn't have noticed is that the compass was giving out false readings. Now, as I said earlier, it was due to the iron hull of this ship that was throwing off the compass readings. And one reason as to why this major problem with the compass might have been overlooked is because the iron hull on ships was a relatively new concept at the time. Think of this time period as the time in between where the clipper ships of old and the steamships that would be coming later. Think of this as the time period where all of the design elements were kind of blending together. Because if you remember my video on the RMS Atlantic, it was a steamship in the 1870s, but it had a few elements on it that were very similar to clipper ships. So at the time of the Tayleur, a lot of these problems probably hadn't been figured out yet. One such problem would be the compass. But yes, so as they were sailing along and they were trying to navigate using the ship's compass, the plan was for the Tayleur to depart Liverpool, head west across the Irish Sea, and then turn south. But because the compass was malfunctioning, they never realized that they hadn't got their south turn correct. So while the crew on board the Tayleur thought they were heading south, they were actually continuing to head west across the Irish Sea, heading straight for Ireland.
The following map you see is something that I whipped up real quick just to show you guys the actual route the Tayleur took on its maiden voyage. The red line you see coming from Liverpool is the actual route the Tayleur took, and the green line you see going south is the planned route that the crew on the Tayleur were trying to take as they were continuing on for Australia. And the yellow line you see is the deviation route. So that's the route the Tayleur was actually on when the crew thought they were heading south. The truth is they were continuing to travel west, heading straight towards Ireland.
Now, on the 21st of January, 1854, the Tayleur encountered a very thick fog and a very bad storm. Due to the high winds they were facing that day, it made it nearly impossible for them to turn the Tayleur. And due to the very heavy fog, it made it very hard for them to see what was ahead of them. But at this point, the crew probably wasn't too concerned with the lack of being able to turn the ship because they still think they're heading south in the right direction, even though they're heading west. Now, as the conditions around them continued to get worse, the ship continued to sail straight towards the coast of Ireland.
And then at 11 a.m. on the 21st of January, 1854, the lookouts on the Tayleur spotted land dead ahead. The ship was traveling straight towards the island of Lambray, which lies just off the coastline of Ireland. But they tried to turn the ship around the island, but by then it was too late. The bottom of the Tayleur scraped against some rocks that lie just off the shoreline, and the ship hit the island, causing a huge amount of damage below the waterline and causing the vessel to rapidly begin to sink. One important detail that you need to understand when trying to imagine what the people on the Tayleur were facing when the ship struck the island is the actual location at which the Tayleur struck the island of Lambray. The following picture you see is the actual location at which the Tayleur struck the island, and that little tiny boat you see out in the middle of the bay, well, that little boat is floating over the wreck of the Tayleur. I have it circled in red. So as you can see, the spot where the Tayleur hit the island is nothing but cliffs and rock. There's no beach or anything for the vessel to actually beach itself on. So that means that when the Tayleur struck the island, it may have slid up onto the cliffside briefly, but then the ship would have slid backwards and went back into the water, causing the ship to rapidly begin to sink.
Now, at the time the Tayleur made contact with the island and began to sink, the weather conditions around the ship were still very bad. There was still a raging storm around the ship, the ocean was still very high and rough, the wind was still blowing very strongly, so they had a really hard time trying to get the evacuation of the Tayleur underway. One of the first actions the captain of the Tayleur made was to try to launch one of the ship's lifeboats, but as soon as this boat made contact with the water, a giant wave came up and slammed the lifeboat against the cliffside of the island, shattering the boat to pieces and killing those on board. So what the crew ended up having to do was they knocked down one of the Tayleur's masts, and because the ship was so close to land, the top part of the mast made contact with the island. So a lot of the passengers and crew on the Tayleur were able to climb across the mast and get over to the island. That's pretty insane when you think about it. And they did the best they could to evacuate as many people from the Tayleur as they could, and the captain was one of the final people to leave the ship. But as the conditions continued to deteriorate, a big wave came up and washed the Tayleur away from the island and shoved it further back out to sea, where the vessel would eventually sink.
Now, at the time the Tayleur went down, she sank in water that was roughly 105 feet deep. So when the ship made contact with the seafloor, the top of her masts were still sticking up out of the water. So several of the Tayleur's passengers that weren't able to get off the ship before she sank, they climbed up the ship's mast and waited at the top until help would finally arrive. Now, some of the Tayleur's passengers and crew that did make it over to the island, they went and alerted the Coast Guard about the disaster, but it still took them 14 hours before help would arrive. So the people who climbed to the top of the mast and decided to wait there until rescue had to sit up there for 14 hours until help would finally arrive.
Now, in the official inquiry into the disaster, they were trying to determine the exact number of lives lost, and depending on what source you use today, that number varies a little bit. But of the 680 people that were on board the ship at the time of the maiden voyage, between 297 and 380 people lost their lives. And no matter which number it is, that is still a huge loss of life. And of the 100 women that were on board, only 3 survived the sinking. The theory as to why so few women survived is because of the type of clothing that they wore at the time. You know, it was very heavy and very unruly if it got wet, so it was probably extremely difficult for women to swim to shore if they were wearing those type of clothes when the ship went down, which is probably what happened. But yeah, even so, the sinking of the RMS Tayleur, given that it was its maiden voyage and everything, it is commonly referred to as the first Titanic, and honestly, I understand why. Because if you really study the Tayleur, it does have a lot of similarities with the Titanic, you know? She was a big vessel, it was her maiden voyage, she was technically advanced for the period. Sounds a lot like Titanic. But yeah, guys, so now you know the story of the White Star Line's first Titanic. You know the story of the RMS Tayleur.
Special thanks to Patreon Captain level supporter Callum Whaley. Thank you so much for all the support, man.